Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first video in the series, Designing Instruction with Equity by Design. My name is Andre Zarati, and I am one of the journey agents here in the 228 Accelerator. I've been an educator for the past 10 years, and I'm so excited to participate in this fellowship with you and be along this journey where we take a look at how Equity by Design and the design frameworks and how they could be incorporated in the classroom to make us such better at bleh. Okay. Hello, everybody. No. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first video in this series, Designing Instructions with Equity by Design. My name is Andre Zarati, and I'm one of the 228 Accelerator Journey Agents. I've been an educator for the last 10 years, and I'm so excited to go through this fellowship with you, to learn from you, and to also just participate in helping making sure that our classrooms are the most equitable for our children. So in today's session, the objectives, in this video, we're going to learn how to design instructional tasks at the margins, why it is important, and thought routines needed before, during, and after instruction. We're also going to review the Equity by Design frameworks with attention to the design principle, design at the margins, and starting with yourself. Before we get started, this is just a reminder that racism and inequity are products of design. They didn't just show up here. There's tons of historical evidence, and we know that in the truth of our history, both the racism and equity were designed to make sure that certain groups of people did not get access to the opportunities that we truly deserve. But the great thing that we know as educators and as leaders and as people in our society, they can be redesigned. And it really does start with us, especially in our schools. As educators, we can redesign in the way that our classroom looks, in the way that we teach, and the way that we provide opportunities for our students. So the Equity by Design framework is the combination of the consciousness of equity work with the power of design thinking methodologies. I know from my experience, a lot of design thinking fellowships just focus on the innovation aspect of it, creating prototypes and just redesigning the thinking. But Equity by Design makes us think about people at the margins and designing with them to make sure that we are being equitable in our processes and that we're really designing with them, for them, and by them. So I know last month you worked on this with Caroline, where you looked at the equity design frameworks and that there are three beliefs that we must have in order to design for equity. The first one is to see historical context matters. The past is present in people, things, and systems of oppression, and the past was designed and the present is being designed. We are all designers. The next one is to be seen, radical inclusion. So the problem of equity work, racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, and etc. are rooted in our distance, our single stories, and our habits of exclusion. Radical inclusion is the intentional act of interrupting inequity where it lives and our separations. Recognizing the multiplicity of stories, truths, their proximities, their intersections, and the people who own the stories are requisites of equity design work. And this is radical inclusion. And then finally, for C, process as product. Equity is a verb, and it is a process, not an endpoint. So when we design, both the ends and the means matter. We can't model the future on the past, and we need to live the future that we want today. And so this is where we talked about the 5 design principles, and that in order to design to heal, that we practice designing at the margins, starting with ourselves, seeding power, making the invisible visible, and then speak the future and design the future. But what we're going to focus on today is these two, the first two frameworks, which is design at the margins. We design at the edge of society, solutions at the margins for work for all, innovations based in equity diffuse inward from the bleeding edge, and then starting with yourselves, our identities, race, gender, upbringing, social status, home, language, and etc., that help create our lens for the world and how we make sense of it. And we have to be aware of this lens and the biases it brings with it as we design. It's important to note, and this is something that I've learned, is that a lot of these 5 principles, you come back to it cyclically. So when I first learned this framework, and my brain often thinks linearly, and society often makes us think linearly, but I often use a lot of these design principles throughout the process. And so I start with yourself, for example, is just always happening in every stage. And then you just keep going back to different ones. And so I want to name that this is not a linear process. And just as we just stated, that it's a process and it does take time. And so be patient with yourself and be patient with the students as well. So, there are a few big ideas that are really important before we engage in this work. So, the first one is big idea number one: our bodies matter. So, designing for equity is also about learning about yourself because you experience the world through your body. And throughout this lesson, we're going to learn about tools on how to return to the body as a tool of perception and sense making. And this is one big idea that I have been taking with me over the last 3 years, where I start thinking about how my body is affected in spaces as well. Big idea number two: thoughts drive actions. When we are designing lessons for equity, we are aware of our thought routines before we plan, during the planning process, and after we plan. And we're going to go through like a few questions to ask yourself as you're going through the different processes of planning. Big idea number three: harm happens fast. So we intentionally slow down the thinking process with our breath so that we can observe our own narratives, thinking, and beliefs. Then we can create space for repair. And this is such a big lesson that I've learned over time, is that harm does happen pretty fast and it makes our heart beat faster. It makes you want to take action faster. But when you use the breath to just slow things down, give you space to think and be clear, it helps make the repair process so much better. And we'll talk a little bit about how we're going to slow down this process. Big idea number four: integration matters. Designing for equity in this moment means we integrate what we know about quality, rigor, and cultural relevance. High quality tasks for the multicultural democracy are rigorous, on grade level, and culturally relevant. And I know a lot of these terms, I know for me as an educator, sometimes are used as buzzwords throughout different professional developments. And we'll talk a little bit about like what it means for us to be rigorous, to be on grade level, and to really make sure that our students are represented in our work through cultural relevance. And it's one of my favorite things to do is to work with students on what they feel like they want to learn and how they'll be represented through curriculum throughout the year. And so now we're going to move into thought routines. And so the next few slides will introduce new thought routines to start designing high quality learning materials for multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multicultural democracy. So the first thing to think about is when we're planning the lesson. And so there are 4 areas that you want to think about when you're planning the lesson and we're thinking about designing the margins and starting with ourselves. It is to who are we amplifying? Are we prioritizing joy? Are we showing spaces that we can resist? And how are we using breath and thinking of breath throughout our planning? So for amplify, how can the lessons design amplify the stories do the most marginalized children need to hear and understand to develop a sense of aspiration and strong sense of self? And so think about stories of resistance and power from Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Pacific Islander, queer, trans, and femme presenting people. Also consider stories of white people challenging white supremacy, men challenging the patriarchy, and etc. And I say this because a lot of the times, Caroline and I do the work in banned books in the universe, in the metaverse, and we often talk about how a lot of the books that we read in our schools don't necessarily represent, for example, who I am or who she is and who other people are. And so it's important that we also think about, do the texts and the lessons that we provide allow for us to learn across lines of difference? And so, how do we amplify those stories, even though they're not the most popular texts? The next one is joy. How are the chosen stories and design lessons prioritizing the joy and experiences of marginalized groups? And how are they modeling solidarity across lines of difference? And this is extremely important because I think as a person of color and as someone who identifies as queer, a lot of the narratives that were fed to me as a student was about oppression and the struggles and the difficulties, which is important. But also, as students, we should be able to see the other side of like what brings us joy and what are some examples of that joy. The third one about resist. How can the lessons provide counter narratives to the narratives that are being spread by media, stereotypes, and white supremacy? So we already know that Western media spreads particular kind of propaganda, and it's kind of cyclical to make us think a certain way. How can we provide stories that do provide those counter narratives? And then lastly, in breadth, in what ways does the lessons create space to welcome and honor students' epistemologies, language, and knowledge systems in a lesson? So this means like, how do we welcome what students already know? Because we know that students already bring things to the table. How can we honor them? How can we acknowledge them? And how can they use their voice in the lesson to share those particular stories? Then we also want to think about how, in planning the lesson, we look at the other design frameworks. So, speaking the future, consider the journey to master for the most marginalized student in the domain of skills, concepts, and standards. How does the lessons design acknowledge the pathway to mastery? So, how do we know that our lessons, no matter what the task is at the end, there is a journey for all students to master the content? And that might look different for each and every different student. So, how are we making sure that we scaffold them to get them there? Make the invisible visible. What does mastery look and sound like? How does this lesson communicate this expectation? And what skills do students need the most to be successful in your lesson? So, just thinking through those as you're going along. And then finally, seating power. How are we breaking down the skills to be differentiated and accessible to all students in your classroom? And over the next 6 to 7 months, we'll talk about like different ways and different kinds of questioning that allow us to make sure that students can access the material, especially whatever your end goal is in that lesson. So during the lesson, here are some questions to think about as you're going along. With your attention on the most marginalized and excluded student, notice how students make meaning of the stories that align with their experience. What do you see? What reactions are you seeing with students? Again, with your attention and focusing on the most marginalized and excluded students, notice how students making meaning of the stories that highlight lines of difference. What do you hear? So, what are they saying about these lines of differences? How can you have those conversations with them so that they can acknowledge some of those lines of difference as we're talking about text? And then lastly, again, focusing on the most marginalized and excluded student, how are students' strengths, epistemologies, knowledges, and languages that they bring being represented and honored in your classroom? What do you feel? How do they feel as they're sharing those stories? And then finally, after the lesson, thinking again about that framework, starting with yourself. In what ways were you present and full and your full self in the lesson? Did you feel anything different in that lesson? And it's important to think about like how your joy and your energy was while you were teaching the lesson. And I'll be honest, like sometimes there are lessons that I feel like, oh, I didn't do so great on that, or I didn't feel like I brought my best self. And so that's why we always have to think about how our bodies are within the lesson. Speak the future. How did students respond to the lesson? How do you know? Is there a post buzz? Are students still curious? And how do you know? I love thinking about after a lesson when students are just still talking about the content that we learned in class, even at lunch, and having that post buzz. Like, do students feel like they want to explore more about it? And speaking of exploration, seeding power, are there ways that you can design the lesson, the next lesson with your students? And are there opportunities for exploration? Are there ways for them to explore more about the topic? And that usually creates that buzz that we love to talk about when we learn something new. So, in your next steps, when you think about the next learning experiences that you're designing, use these questions to help design high quality, rigorous, and culturally relevant lessons. You are a designer. Try something new and let's just see what happens. And you can always reach out to Caroline and myself to think if you want some partnership or thought partners around your lessons. You have the community with you here, and you can definitely email Caroline and myself, and I'd be happy to jump on with you in a call to talk about like how we can make that happen. So my email is andre@228accelerator.com. Thank you so much for joining us in this video today. I'm so excited to see what you've tried, and just let's see what happens. All right, have a great day.